wanted to also get your feel for some of these deep receivers. And this is kind of a weird one to me because it depends on like how closely you parse the tiers. But I mean, obviously the top tier, fantastic. Second tier, fantastic. Third tier, again, depending on how many guys you're including, probably very good. But once you get out of that, you still have a lot of guys who are being drafted over viable veterans who probably don't have profiles that necessarily translate into NFL success, on a percentage basis. It doesn't mean that the guys couldn't hit. So we kind of wanted to go through some of these players to find out like what, maybe profiles you like, and then what specific guys you like. I've broken these players down into some buckets. And again, thinking about later round best ball picks pre-draft. So some of the groups have more, some of them have less. We'll start with these guys who are athletic with some final season production. And I mean, this might still be the tier where it seems fairly straightforward to draft them. It's a matter of like how much exposure you're getting. What are you looking at with this type of receiver? Is it one that, you're willing to take some, make some bets on at the prices that you normally get? And then specifically with the guys here, Roman Wilson, Xavier Legette, is it fair to put them in that category? And I mean, is this a category that you will draft?
Yeah, I mean, for best ball purposes and, for Dynasty as well, I think these guys are both very interesting because draft capital looks pretty locked in. Legette's getting mocked in the first round sometimes. Roman Wilson had that little blip of, where he was maybe in the late first round conversation, probably more of a round 2 guy, but that's fine, and I think he's pretty locked into that. And I think Legette as well. I think we're going to see both guys go in round 2. Roman Wilson had a really strong Senior Bowl. He tested really well, and he's the kind of archetype of receiver that I think, he's going to be seen as a fairly reliable guy who's like ready. Legette, bit more of kind of bet on raw athleticism, but he is very athletic. And I think an interesting kind of best ball archetype of like, the big play guy. So I think both are pretty good targets in best ball, and specifically, the underdog style best ball tournaments, I'd be a little less interested, I guess, on drafters where, it's like season long points. I think I feel that both will probably be out there running routes at the end of the season and are good bets for spike weeks, especially at the end of the season. So you're getting, I think, a discount in best ball on what we are usually paying for this level of draft capital. If they're going to be locked in second round picks, Legette having a little bit of a chance to go in the first round. So yeah, I like both. Both definitely
like
have
13, 14 round turn guys.
Yeah. I mean, that's pretty good for a second round. If you go second round pick in the NFL. I mean, I guess that's kind of what we were getting Marvin Mims at, and a little behind where we were taking like Jonathan Mingo, right? Post draft.
And do you think that they'll move once we just have verification?
I think it'll depend.
Because I think that these drafts get tighter in terms of this idea that everybody's going to move up afterward. When you look at some of the prices right now and you're like, well, I mean, drafters adjust year to year. We're not necessarily going to get some of those same moves. But these guys, as you mentioned, those are good prices. You might get a move. Yeah,
no, I think it's tough to predict what the rookie prices will be because, like, Rome Odunze is the wide receiver 3, and he's the most expensive rookie wide receiver ever. He's the wide receiver 3. Like, it's crazy, We've got Neighbor, and I'm not blown away by the prices really on Harrison and Neighbors. I think Neighbors actually like pretty good value relative to Harrison. I mean, you're getting him like a full, you can sit at the same point in the draft and get Neighbors the round after Harrison. That seems pretty nice. So yeah, it's tough because the rookie thirst is definitely increased, but will it apply to the second round picks? And actually, is there a chance these guys fall as more kind of casual drafters coming in the summer and they don't feel like, taking these total dart throws at receiver? Plus, it's a deep class. Lots of guys are going to go in the second round. And so maybe some of these guys get good capital and then end up falling a little bit. But, especially if the landing spot isn't ideal. So, yeah, is a bet purely on them rising in value. It could go against you. But, yeah, I just, when you get to this point in the draft, it's like, man, I've got, like Khalil Shakir, like, is kind of interesting. But what are his routes ultimately if they end up drafting somebody? Or you can take a bet on a guy who's, I think, a pretty strong bet to produce for you at the end of the season, which is just so important in these tournaments.
Next up, athletic with limited production, and Ricky Pearsall is the name that we have listed here, but it may be him, or it may be you may have somebody else in that kind of profiler bucket that you prefer. Have you thoughts on him? And then, is there anyone you prefer?
I like Pearsall a lot because he's so cheap, and I think he's risen in price, but he used to be very, very, very cheap. I used to be able to get him in the 200s. It's actually risen up to 165. So I've got him at 160 now. So not that far ahead of ADP, but I've taken a lot of them.
Have you shifted the ADP by yourself, or?
I mean, I'm trying, I'm drafting enough. It's possible. The Pearsall's like probably more of like a day 2 locked in guy. Like, I think he's a pretty safe bet to go round 2 or 3. And it's just like the reports on him are like, just like a good football player kind of does the dirty work. And I think we'll probably get out there. So is like when he was going very cheaply, I thought he was pretty fun because I felt like you're getting a discount on the draft capital. But this feels about right. His current ADP doesn't kind of, I think, reflects the quality of the bet pretty well now.
I bet. How about some of these guys who have intriguing production, but we know that, it gets tricky when a lot of your teammates are good. And I don't necessarily think that's exactly everything that was going on with Amon-Ra St. Brown, for example, but we've got some names in this draft who, maybe if they had played somewhere else as the star would be bigger, or maybe if they had had the responsibility of taking the defensive attention, we would understand that they're pretty clearly like just guys and maybe, fourth wide receivers at the NFL level or something like that. Players who, aren't going to get the routes, and then when they're out there are also not going to draw the targets. So thinking about a couple of these Washington guys in Polk and McMillan, maybe you have a guy in Jermaine Burton who has, moved through some different situations in his career, maybe a guy like a Johnny Wilson. How are you looking at these types of players? Are there any other names that should be added to that? Who are we targeting?
I've liked Burton a lot because he's a deep threat, and I think he's a good bet for draft capital. I think he could go second round. I think he probably goes third round if not. And he was productive in his final season. Now, this is as a fourth-year player, but he had a 35% dominator rating at Alabama, and he had 30% of their yards. So, it was partially touchdown-driven, 40% of their touchdowns, but 30% yardage share is pretty good. Now, if this guy was like being held up as a great prospect, I would be tearing that down, saying he didn't do anything until his final season. But he's not. He's a total dart throw, and he is like a true deep threat outside guy that is not, a bad archetype for better in best ball, I think is the term that was raised earlier. Yeah, we can use that with Burton. He's just so cheap. I've taken a ton of them. And I do think we probably have moved the ADP on Jermaine Burton because we've had him consistently higher than his ADP, and he is finally starting to move up. Javon Baker is another guy I take. I don't know if he would be in this group exactly, but he's another guy I think probably fairly safe to go day 2. and it's just like extremely cheap. I do take some Jalen McMillan because he's the cheaper of the two non-Adunze Washington guys. Johnny Wilson, I've been a little bit wary of because I'm not as confident in the draft capital. He's kind of this like really oversized wide receiver who doesn't play like a huge wide receiver, kind of Chase Claypool-y maybe in that way. But Claypool was a pretty big hit early on, and certainly a guy you wanted to have in best ball. So I've actually been wondering if I've been too low on Johnny Wilson. Do you have any thoughts on these guys? Because like I know with McMillan, he dealt with the injury this past year, but like Burton and Wilson, what do you like from the Devy side of things? Like how do you view those guys?
McMillan is interesting because as I was putting together the write-ups for the RotoViz rookie guide, it really appeared to me that if it weren't for the injury, that he would be ahead of Polk. And that, actually does flip him in a pretty meaningful way. Maybe the prices for both aren't inexpensive enough that it doesn't, matter that much. But if McMillan is pretty clearly the better guy or possibly the better guy, then that does seem like an exploitable way to play it. I mean, Wilson was the other player who seemed pretty interesting to me because when you look at a lot of the different metrics there in the final year, I mean, he looks better than Keon Coleman. Now, it doesn't seem like that belief is shared by the football people, which again would indicate that. I mean, you think about some of the fun things about Devin Funchess's profile, and then, I mean, that was obviously pretty useless.
That's a good name. It's sort of similar, that big wide receiver, but not an overpowering wide receiver.
The other thing there is that both Coleman and Wilson in the Sports Info Solutions charting, their on-target catch percentages were incredibly bad. And so if you're already maybe
that was Wilson and who?
And Coleman.
And Coleman. Okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you're looking at guys who maybe are going to have some trouble drawing targets at the NFL level anyway, because of exactly what they are, and then when you draw a target, you like bat it to the sidelines or,
So now we're having trouble getting routes, getting targets, and catching the ball.
So, but if Wilson went out there and gets on the right team and, has a 12 touchdown season because like every time they were in the red zone, they're like, what can't be covered is that dude. Let me just make sure you get the ball high enough. Then, I mean, I think that part is interesting. It's more almost a way of how he reflects on the also disconcerting elements of his, former teammates' profiles and projections.
Right. Keon Coleman is such a tricky eval. Where are you at on him?
Yeah, I mean, his is one that I guess I'm not sure works. And I still don't understand at all what happened in 2022 at Michigan State with the numbers that Jaden Reed had, the numbers that Coleman had, and then you look at the final season wasn't good. And so why are people so interested in a guy who also, doesn't test well? And then you're like, well, I mean, he was the best guy running a drill that is not a football thing. So like if they start doing a deal where you got to run straight down a line and like catch balls from both sides, then I mean, because it seems like we're maybe only a year.
Are you looking for them to add something to the Pro Bowl competitions that it like straight line run? No.
Well, I guess maybe Pat, you can explain this to us, but it seems like they've changed the kickoff rules, and it seems like they made them more exciting. I don't understand how it accomplishes any safety objective, but
they're closer together, so they can't kind of get up as much speed before they hit each other. That's my understanding.
I don't know. We do need to have new rules also for onside kicks.
Is this rule to give Keon Coleman a role?
Yeah, so like you run the gauntlet as the game is on the line to decide
We're changing the NFL rulebook just to Keon Coleman can do something?
Yeah.
It seems like a red flag.
He's a player where I think it could definitely work, and there are some exciting plays, and yet it seems like you're already, unless the price ends up being different later than it is now. It seems like the NFL team that drafts him and fantasy managers who draft him are drafting almost exclusively based on one of the best outcomes. And it's not that can't work. I mean, people do that all the time and hit and then, brag about it for a year, which you should do if you hit. Right? But over time, that doesn't seem like a way to make things work. It also doesn't seem exactly like where we are now with the way the NFL game works.
Yeah.
I mean, I'd love for big receivers to dominate, but they don't.
Yeah, especially if you can't separate, which is this whole red flag. I'm struggling with Coleman. I don't have a ton of enthusiasm, but he's actually like AD Mitchell scares me too. But AD Mitchell is expensive and seems like he's getting locked into that expensive price. Whereas Coleman is now falling in best ball, and you can get him fairly cheap. And I'm doing that. If he falls far enough, I want to get some exposure. At a certain point, he becomes like a similar bet to like Xavier Legette. Like his ADP is 133. Legette's is in the 150s, so he's got to fall. But if you're sitting in the 140s and Keon Coleman's there, like that seems pretty good to me. But yeah, I think generally like one red flag that I noticed this, we did this with Tony Pollard. Anytime someone's citing a bull indicator that is never used for any other player, I think probably a red flag. Tony Pollard was the number one in PFF rushing grade from like weeks 9 to 12. It's like, have we ever done that for anyone in the history of fantasy before now? Because it seems like this is the first I'm hearing of PFF rushing splits. And it's the same with Coleman and his gauntlet. I didn't know we were using the miles per hour on the gauntlet as a predictive metric, but I guess we are now. That seems maybe like I don't know. Can you give me like the miles per hour of any other receivers in history in their gauntlet? Because I maybe want to back test this slightly. So Coleman scares me, but in a nice way. Always with these guys, right? I want to get what's better than being mostly out on a guy and then getting handed a cheap hedge. And that's what you get with Coleman in best ball. You can get some exposure to him at a pretty cheap price. And so if he hits and you have 0 dynasty shares, maybe he wins you a best ball tournament.
We were talking there about changing the entire rule book of the NFL to get production, but the way the NFL has changed is yards after the catch guys are becoming more and more valuable, and there's a couple of those guys in this bracket. I'm interested if there's any other ones that you might be looking at as well. We have Malik Washington, Malachi Corley, Jacob Kerrane.
I'm not that interested in these guys because of different reasons, really. I think with Cowing, I was the most interested in him from the profile, but the draft capital doesn't seem like it's going to be there. And day 3 wide receivers are always pretty thin bets. We have had some hits, but he's also got size issues too. He's really small. So it's like a small speed slot with no draft capital seems like a fairly thin bet. Malik Washington.
Go to exclusively drafting day 3 guys after the Puka eruption.
So now we only want day 3 guys?
That's
where it seems like the massive upside is. Come on, I mean,
I guess
you're
upside,
it's important
right?
to
Upside.
overreact is the.
But I mean, I don't know that any of these 3 really fits that kind of like, big time producer. These are kind of more gadgety guys. These are your rotational receivers. Corley, I've really struggled with. Reeves comped him to Amari Rodgers, which I think is pretty good.
Or pretty bad.
Yeah, or pretty bad. Yeah, good point. At least Malik Washington, it was really efficient in his final season, and so that kind of is the most Puka-y, I would say, of these three. But I don't know. I've kind of struggled with getting excited about Washington. Really like pretty old when he pops, and I don't know about the draft capital for him. So this group is the one I'm probably the least excited about of the ones we talked about.
So Colm has cut this from the show sheet here. I don't know if he is done or what his thinking is, but I wanted to ask you about these guys with sort of the interesting paths, maybe the small school players.
Definitely not by design. This is news to me that I've accidentally consumed.
So, Pat, I think maybe the most disappointing thing about Luke McCaffrey is that you get this dead ringer for Christian, and yet and the testing is fantastic. Once he finally was willing to play, I'd say willing, who knows if that was the situation, but to play wide receiver is actually quite good at it. And yet one of the things that surprises me a lot with him is that the evasion numbers, the numbers when he has the ball in his hands are actually pretty bad. And you're thinking like Christian McCaffrey, incredible athletic testing, this, later breakout guy because he switches positions. Maybe he could be, obviously not Christian McCaffrey. That's, once in a lifetime type of player, but maybe this guy could be somebody who's very, very relevant. And then you dig into it some more, and it doesn't seem like he's done those same kinds of things on the football field. Do you have some small school guys that you like, or any of these players who have maybe changed positions or something to that effect? Kind of again, as late dart throw types of players.
Yeah, I think the two guys that jump out to me are Javon Baker and Jamari Thrash. I think both those guys are pretty interesting. They were both like solidly productive. Thrash had a 28% career yardage share. Baker was at 25%. Neither of those are great, but they were solidly productive. Javon Baker as an underclassman was at 2 yards per route run, which is pretty good. Jamari Thrash was at 2.16. Neither of those numbers is amazing, but they're both pretty solid. So they're this and I think both of them seem to be in the mix for draft capital. Going back and watching some of Connor Rogers stuff, he was talking about Jamari Thrash a fair amount, kind of heading into the season and throughout the season is like one of these guys to kind of have on the radar. And so neither of them are particularly exciting in their profiles, but guys who can kind of get out there, earn routes fairly early on in their careers and look like they could be professional wide receivers is kind of the bet with both guys. And they're getting them really cheap. Thrash mostly doesn't get drafted in these best ball. I don't even take him because I'm taking some of these other guys that I find a little bit more exciting. But, it's like Johnny Wilson also, doesn't get drafted a lot. You can take him, or you could take a guy who's a little bit more of you're playing for a single or a double rather than a home run in a Jamari Thrash. But I think that's fine. Javon Baker's similar as well, though I take him a bit more. He seems to be kind of on the draft radar and no one cares. So, and he's a little bit bigger. He's over 200 pounds, not huge, but if you're kind of betting on a guy who's just going to be able to get out there and play like a professional wide receiver position right away, being around 200 is nice for that. Thrash, I think, is 188. Yeah, so I'm not painting the most exciting profiles of these guys, but I think they're capable and they're probably going to have okay draft position. And so if you can hit with a free pick, if you can get a guy who's a early third round pick who plays pretty early on in his rookie season, that's kind of a smash. So that's why I like both these guys.
Well, I may have to dive in a little bit deeper and kind of refresh my perspective on Baker because he's somebody who Travis May also discussed last week as being somebody pretty interesting. And I guess it hasn't necessarily popped for me, but if you guys are both saying that, I mean, he's going to get drafted and, not just drafted, but, if you're talking about day 2, then, I mean, it gets more interesting, and you have to make sure that you're pretty acquainted with that name.
One thing I'd say about him too is that he was pretty good in terms of being able to produce yards deep. So Baker had 79% of his career yards on 10+ yard targets. So this guy was producing downfield. He also had 42% of his yards on 20+ yard targets. And he had a pretty low 30%, which is pretty low contested deep targets. So he's producing as a deep threat and he's getting open is kind of the hope there, right? He's not a ton of contested targets. So he also had a really, really strong contested catch rate on those deep targets of 81%. So showing the ability to win in contested catch situations, but not be in them all the time and produce on downfield targets. That's kind of like helps solidify for me that Baker, he looks like a real NFL wide receiver. Like he's in comparison to a guy like Corley, like I don't have to design touches for Javon Baker. The touches that are designed are like normal NFL plays, which I like. That's kind of, it doesn't seem like the most high upside dart throw, but if a guy gets out there and has a role as a rookie, like at this price, that's already a huge hit.
That's awesome. I think the listeners are going to be very excited here and get those late options to dive into, and going to be interesting to see how the draft fits and then how he gets on as a rookie. We can circle back to this clip, Pat, where you hyped him up. But that is going to do it for...
I didn't think I was going to be touting Javon Baker that hard, but here we are.
There's number one fan now. That is what is confirmed. But we are going to finish it up there. It's been a lot of fun. We've talked through wide receivers, running backs, quarterbacks. It has been awesome. Obviously, I mentioned at the start, you can check out Pat at legendaryupside.com. But Pat, you've hyped up some of the NFL players. Hype up Legendary Upside and let the listeners know what they should be checking out over there.
Yeah, so I'm going to have my rookie running back profiles dropping. The first part of that will drop tomorrow morning, Tuesday morning. And quarterbacks already up. Wide receivers, tight ends coming out here. I announced on Ship Chasing last week that my wife is pregnant. We're going to be having a baby girl.
Round of applause.
On like a week from now. Like I've announced this pretty late in the process. It's where she's getting induced on the 9th. So
my daughter's birthday's the 9th. She's
awesome.
6, so
awesome.
6 years apart.
Love it. So we're gonna, the rookie content will be written. Maybe I'll publish one of them after the 9th just to kind of space it out. But it'll have been written beforehand. And yeah, so you can kind of count on that all to be done very soon. There are some additional articles that'll be out on the site in the 2 weeks that I'll be out after that. Sacrilegious is working on some cool kind of like macro sort of strategy ideas on best ball stuff. I actually have an evergreen article I might get out during that point as well. And then I'll be back for the draft. We're doing a Ship Chasing live stream for night 1 of the draft, and that'll be my return to work. So that's what we got going on.
Pat, congratulations. That's really cool.
Thank you. Yeah, very excited.
Exciting, and not long away now, so we'll keep track of that and then see how things play out. This is an exciting time, and we wish you and your, I guess, new family all the best. It's strange to try and come up with words. I think men are particularly bad in the situation with what you're meant to say. But that is the perfect. Yeah. That's the perfect way.
It is hard to come up with words at times, for sure.
Yeah, we have talked for over 90 minutes, so we've run out. But that is going to leave us for this edition of RotoViz Overtime. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at Overtime Ireland. You can check out all of Shawn's work up on rotoviz.com. And of course, check out Pat on Twitter at Pat Kerrane. And until we are back, have a good one.